China's public response to a proposed United States naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, delivered in direct language and tied explicitly to energy security, is not an isolated diplomatic statement. It is a signal rooted in structural dependence, regional instability, and a widening gap in how both sides interpret risk. Here is what happened. A video news report described a scenario in which Donald Trump raised the possibility of a naval blockade targeting Iran in the Strait of Hormuz. In response, Beijing issued a clear position. Chinese officials pushed back against the idea of such a blockade. They called for an immediate ceasefire between the United States and Iran. They urged all parties to avoid escalation. At the same time, they rejected accusations that China had been supplying weapons to Iran, describing those claims as unfounded. And they placed responsibility for disruptions in navigation in the strait on the ongoing war involving Iran, not on external actors attempting to maintain or control maritime access. That sequence matters. It is not just a diplomatic exchange, it is a layered response that combines denial, positioning, and strategic signaling. Let me be precise about this. China did not simply reject the allegation of arms transfers. It connected that rejection to a broader framing of the situation, one in which instability in the Strait of Hormuz is the result of active conflict, and where external escalation, particularly through blockade, would worsen conditions rather than stabilize them. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. Most coverage treats this as a rhetorical clash. It is not. It is a structural intersection of three issues: maritime choke points, energy security, and great power signaling. Consider the geography here. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical maritime passages in the world. A significant portion of global oil shipments passes through this narrow corridor. When China references shipping and energy security, it is not using abstract language. It is referring to a system on which its domestic economic stability depends. Here is what the data actually shows. China is one of the largest importers of energy resources, including oil that transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Any disruption in that flow is not a distant geopolitical concern. It is a direct input into domestic economic functioning, manufacturing, transportation, and broader industrial output. Think carefully about what that means. A naval blockade, even if framed as targeted or limited, introduces uncertainty into that system. Uncertainty in maritime transit translates into volatility in supply. Volatility in supply translates into domestic economic pressure. And for Beijing, domestic stability is not a secondary concern. It is the primary mandate. This is not what most people think it is. The Chinese statement calling for a ceasefire is not simply a call for peace. It is a call for the restoration of predictable conditions in a critical global artery. When Beijing urges restraint, it is not positioning itself as a neutral mediator in a moral sense. It is acting to preserve a system that it depends on. We have seen this pattern before, not in identical form, but in structure. Whenever a major power's economic lifelines intersect with a conflict zone, its diplomatic posture reflects that dependency. The language may emphasize stability, restraint, and de-escalation, but beneath that language is a calculation about risk exposure. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. The denial of arms shipments to Iran is not just about rejecting an accusation. It is about maintaining a specific position in the conflict structure. If China were perceived as materially supporting one side in an active conflict affecting a global choke point, it would alter how other actors interpret its role. It would invite countermeasures. It would complicate its ability to argue for neutrality and restraint. So the denial serves two functions. It addresses the immediate claim, and it preserves strategic flexibility. Now consider the United States' position as described in the report. The idea of a naval blockade is not a casual suggestion. It is a tool of coercive pressure. It is designed to restrict movement, constrain resources, and force behavioral change. In historical terms, blockades are escalatory instruments. They sit at a point where economic pressure intersects with military enforcement. Washington reads this as leverage. Beijing reads this as disruption. And this is where the two frameworks begin to diverge in a way that matters. The United States, when considering a blockade, is evaluating how to shape the behavior of Iran through pressure applied at a critical node. China, observing the same action, is evaluating how that pressure affects the stability of a system it relies on. Both readings follow internal logic, but they do not align. Let me introduce a pattern interrupt here. Washington calls this a strategic option. Beijing calls it a destabilizing act. The terminology tells you everything about why they cannot currently communicate effectively. Now, return to the Chinese statement about the source of disruption. Beijing attributes navigation problems in the Strait of Hormuz to the ongoing war in Iran. This is an important framing choice. It shifts the focus from potential future actions, like a blockade, to existing conditions, the conflict itself. This framing does two things. First, it places responsibility on the current state of war, rather than on hypothetical escalation by external actors. Second, it reinforces the call for ceasefire as the primary solution to restoring stability. There is a data point in this report that changes the structural picture entirely. We will get to it. The emphasis on calm and restraint is consistent with this framing. It positions China as advocating for de-escalation across all parties rather than isolating a single actor as the source of risk. But again, this is not neutral language in the abstract. It is structured language tied to a specific outcome, the preservation of uninterrupted maritime flow. Now step back for a moment. This is not a sudden development. It is part of a broader pattern in which regional conflicts intersect with global economic systems, and where major powers respond based on how those intersections affect their core interests. And this is the structural question that emerges from the context. If one side views a blockade as a legitimate tool of pressure, and another side views that same blockade as a direct threat to its economic stability, how do those two positions coexist without producing escalation? That is the question the rest of this analysis has to answer. Stability is not neutral when dependence is uneven. The strategic logic of this situation becomes clear only when you separate what each side says from what each side's decisions reveal, because the language of diplomacy often obscures the underlying calculation. Let me be precise about this. China's response is built on three observable positions: rejection of arms transfer accusations, opposition to a naval blockade, and a call for ceasefire and restraint. These are not independent statements. They are components of a single strategic posture. To understand why Beijing made this decision, you have to understand the context in which China evaluates risk. China's primary concern in this scenario is not Iran as a political actor. It is the stability of a critical maritime corridor through which energy flows. The Strait of Hormuz is not peripheral to China's system. It is embedded within it. When Chinese officials reference shipping and energy security, they are identifying a vulnerability that sits at the intersection of geography and economics. Here is what is actually happening. Beijing is assessing the situation through a framework of exposure. The more unstable the strait becomes, the higher the risk to its energy imports. The higher the risk to its energy imports, the greater the pressure on its domestic economy. And domestic stability, as I have said before, is the central organizing principle of Chinese policy. So when China calls for a ceasefire, it is not simply advocating for de-escalation as a general principle. It is advocating for the restoration of conditions that reduce systemic risk to its own economy. This is where most analysis misses one critical factor. China's denial of arms shipments to Iran is not just about reputation, it is about positioning. If Beijing were seen as contributing materially to the conflict, it would weaken its ability to argue for stability. It would also increase the likelihood that other actors, particularly the United States, would interpret China as a participant rather than an observer. And that distinction matters, because once an actor is seen as a participant, the range of responses available to others expands. Diplomatic space narrows. Strategic assumptions harden. Now consider the United States' position. A naval blockade is not simply a signal, it is an action with direct operational implications. It involves the use of naval forces to restrict or control maritime movement. It introduces enforcement mechanisms, and it carries with it the possibility of confrontation at sea. Washington's logic, as reflected in the report, is tied to pressure. The blockade is conceived as a way to constrain Iran's ability to operate within the maritime domain. It is a tool designed to shape behavior by altering access. From Washington's perspective, this is a form of leverage. From Beijing's perspective, this is a source of instability. And this is where the two strategic frameworks collide. Washington reads the blockade as targeted. Beijing reads it as systemic. Think carefully about what that means. If the United States believes it can apply pressure in a controlled way, it assumes that the effects of that pressure will remain contained. If China believes that any disruption in the strait produces broader instability, it assumes that the effects will extend beyond the immediate target. Both assumptions are internally consistent, but they lead to different conclusions about acceptable risk. We have seen this exact dynamic before, not in this specific location, but in structure. When one power uses a tool of coercion that affects a shared system, and another power depends on that system, the second power reacts not to the intention behind the tool, but to its potential impact. This is not about trust, it is about exposure. And this is the part of the report that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. The disagreement is not over facts. It is over how those facts are interpreted through different strategic lenses. Now return to China's statement about the source of disruption. Beijing attributes navigation issues in the Strait of Hormuz to the ongoing war in Iran. This is a deliberate framing. It places the origin of instability within the conflict itself, rather than in the responses being considered by external actors. This allows China to maintain a consistent position. The solution is to end the conflict, not to introduce new forms of pressure. At the same time, it avoids directly confronting the United States in accusatory terms. The language is calibrated. It emphasizes restraint. It calls for calm. But the underlying message is clear. Actions that increase instability in the strait are unacceptable from China's perspective. Let me introduce another pattern interrupt. Washington sees an opportunity to apply pressure. Beijing sees a risk to system stability. Both are acting rationally within their own frameworks. The problem is that those frameworks do not intersect. Now consider the denial of arms transfers again, but from a different angle. If China were supplying weapons to Iran, it would imply a level of alignment that contradicts its stated position of neutrality and restraint. By rejecting these claims, Beijing is reinforcing its narrative that it is not a party to the conflict, but rather an advocate for stability. This is not just about external perception, it is about internal consistency in policy signaling. Because inconsistency creates uncertainty, and uncertainty in a system already under stress amplifies risk. There is a data point in this report that changes the structural picture entirely. It is not a number, it is a linkage. The linkage between maritime access and domestic stability. Once you understand that linkage, China's response becomes predictable. Any action that threatens the continuity of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz will be met with opposition, regardless of the political framing attached to that action. This is not ideological, it is structural. And this brings us to the central consequence that emerges from the strategic logic. If the United States continues to consider measures like a naval blockade as viable tools, and China continues to interpret those measures as threats to its core economic interests, then the interaction between these two positions becomes a source of friction that extends beyond the immediate context of Iran. This is no longer just about one region or one conflict. It becomes part of a larger pattern in which actions taken in one domain produce reactions in another, because the systems are interconnected. And this is where the analysis has to go next. Because the question is no longer just about what each side is doing. The question is about what happens when these two logics continue to operate simultaneously, without a mechanism to reconcile them. Miscalculation begins where assumptions go unexamined. The structural conclusion emerges not from any single statement or proposal, but from the interaction of two strategic logics that are operating in parallel, each internally consistent and each increasingly incompatible in practice. Let me be very precise about this. China's position, as expressed in the response, is anchored in system preservation. The emphasis on ceasefire, restraint, and the rejection of escalation is tied directly to maintaining stability in a maritime corridor that is essential to its economic functioning. The denial of arms transfers reinforces a posture of non-participation. The attribution of disruption to the ongoing war frames the problem as one that must be resolved at its source. The United States' position, as reflected in the consideration of a naval blockade, is anchored in coercive leverage. The blockade is conceived as a means to shape the behavior of Iran by restricting access and applying pressure at a critical node. It is an instrument designed to produce change through constraint. These two positions are not mirror images. They are structurally different responses to the same environment. And this is where the analysis has to step back. This is not a crisis in the sense of being sudden. It is the visible point of a deeper pattern. When a global system depends on shared infrastructure, in this case a maritime choke point, and when that infrastructure becomes entangled in conflict, the actions taken by one actor to resolve that conflict can be interpreted by another actor as a threat to system stability. This was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions. The ongoing war in Iran created the initial condition of instability. That instability affected navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The possibility of a naval blockade introduced a new variable, one that would alter the flow of shipping directly. China's response followed from its assessment of how that variable would affect its own exposure. And this is the pattern, not just in this case, but in every case where economic interdependence intersects with geopolitical conflict. The tools of pressure used by one actor often sit within systems that other actors depend on. When those tools are activated, the effects are not contained, they propagate. Think carefully about what that means. If a blockade is implemented, it does not only affect the intended target, it affects every actor whose economic activity relies on that passage. If those actors perceive the blockade as a threat to their own stability, they respond. Not necessarily with direct confrontation, but with diplomatic pressure, strategic positioning, and adjustments to their own policies. And this is where the margin for error becomes very small. Because each action taken to manage one aspect of the situation introduces new variables into another. The system becomes more sensitive. The range of outcomes narrows. Let me introduce a historical echo. We have seen this dynamic in different forms across multiple regions and periods. The specifics change. The structure does not. When major powers interact through shared systems, and when those systems are stressed, the absence of aligned interpretations increases the likelihood of miscalculation. Miscalculation requires only different definitions of risk. Now return to the language used by China. The call for an immediate ceasefire is not simply a preference, it is a requirement for restoring a baseline level of predictability. The emphasis on restraint is not rhetorical, It is a signal that further escalation will be viewed as a direct increase in systemic risk. The rejection of accusations about arming Iran is not defensive alone. It is an effort to maintain a position that allows China to advocate for stability without being seen as contributing to instability. Each element of the statement aligns with a single objective: prevent additional disruption to a critical system. Now consider why a de-escalatory path is not being taken, based on the information available. The United States, in considering a blockade, is operating within a framework where pressure is seen as a necessary tool. The logic is that without pressure, there is limited ability to influence outcomes. The blockade is therefore evaluated in terms of its effectiveness in constraining Iran. China, observing this, evaluates the same action in terms of its impact on system stability. From this perspective, the introduction of a blockade increases uncertainty and risk. These two evaluations do not converge. And this is the structural constraint. For a de-escalatory path to emerge, both sides would need to align not only on desired outcomes, but on acceptable methods. That alignment is not present in the positions described. One side is considering escalation through pressure, the other is advocating for de-escalation through restraint. Both sides are making this worse, not through intention, but through the interaction of their strategies. Washington's consideration of a blockade introduces a potential disruption to a shared system. Beijing's response, while advocating restraint, also signals that such actions are unacceptable from its perspective. Each side is reinforcing its own logic, without adjusting for the other's interpretation. And this is the part that requires careful attention. Because the issue is not limited to this specific scenario. It reflects a broader pattern in how major powers interact in a system where economic interdependence and strategic competition coexist. When those two conditions are present, actions taken in one domain cannot be isolated from their effects in another. The question that remains is not whether these interactions will continue. They will. The question is under what conditions they produce stability, and under what conditions they produce escalation. In the scenario described, the conditions for stability would require reducing the factors that disrupt the Strait of Hormuz. That points directly to the ongoing war in Iran, which China identifies as the source of navigation disruption. Ending or de-escalating that conflict would remove the immediate cause of instability. At the same time, it would require restraint in the introduction of new measures that could further disrupt the system. That includes actions like a naval blockade. But the positions outlined do not indicate movement in that direction. They indicate a continuation of existing approaches. And this brings us to the structural conclusion. When two powers depend on the same system, but define threats to that system differently, their attempts to manage risk will, over time, generate the very instability they are trying to avoid.